Welcome, everybody, to the Royal Asiatic Society. My name is Norbert Peabody, and I'm the president of the Society. And before this special evening of honoring Professor Peter Robb, I wanted to encourage everybody who is not a member, currently a member of the Society, to join and support our good works here, support events such as this, scholarship, and preserve the collections that we have here that are an invaluable resource for scholarship of Asia. So if you're not a member, please contact Allison or me afterwards, and we'll put you on the golden path to membership. This evening is tremendously special to all of us here in the room and online, as it gives us an opportunity to recognize the significant contributions both to the Society and to scholarship of South Asia and Asia writ large by Peter over the course of many, many years. Peter came to us from the University of Wellington, or came to this country from the University of Wellington, where he did his BA in English and History in some forgotten year. And then when he arrived here, he did a PhD at SOAS, which he completed in 1971, and never left, which is absolutely remarkable. He held numerous positions at SOAS, both departmental positions, but also he was a pro-director of SOAS from 2003 to 2008, and supervising numerous 30-odd or more than 30-odd PhD students, many of whom are actually members of the Society as well. So he did a good job. I can think of Joy Bhattacharya, Upal Chakrabarti, and several others who've come through our doors. So we're thankful for Peter for that. During his time, he's also been the chair of the Council of the Society for South Asian Studies and chair of the British Association of South Asian Studies, and has been a member of the British Academy's South Asia panel. But from our perspective, as important, or most importantly, he was a past president of the Society from 2012 to 2015. And Peter was, I would say, one of a group of 4 past presidents in the first 2 decades of this millennium, who helped lead the Society out of difficult times. Francis Robinson, the other part of the quartet would be Francis Robinson, Tony Stockwell, and Gordon. And the good situation that Sarah and Sari and I have subsequently found the Society is really due to the work that you did in writing the Society in a time when it really needed strong guidance. So we are extremely grateful for that work. Now, Peter, as many of you will know, has produced over 20 single-authored monographs and edited volumes across a wide range of subjects dealing with South Asia. The edited volumes have touched on such important issues of caste, race, and state building. He's written the definitive, or one of the most widely used textbooks on the history of India, history of South Asia, used in universities at the moment. His history of South Asia, or history of India, which has gone into at least one rewrite and reprint. His single-authored monographs have really covered a wide range of topics. He, perhaps started out making a significant contribution to agrarian history, particularly by showing that agrarian change and development, which he was particularly studying in Bihar and in Bengal, can best be understood through an investigation of the linkages between localities and the outside world. And what is interesting is that in these studies, he showed how larger influences, largely the result of colonialism, were inflected in different ways through specific localities. And he thus eschewed any single master narrative which accounts for the diversity of experiences that one witnessed in the agrarian history. He's also had more broadly based studies on colonialism that again moved away from the simplistic argument that India's development trajectory into commercial agriculture was solely the result of British policies, or into examining the manner in which India itself was contributing to the shaping of British policy through economic, social, and intellectual channels. And again, he's mined the rich seam of perspectives that look at the interface between local and global phenomenon. More recently, he has undertaken a series of an edited compendium of Richard Bletchenden's Calcutta Diaries, which chronicled the everyday life of 18th and early 19th century Calcutta, again providing another rich record of the social networks that operated within this cosmopolitan city, social networks that brought Indians and Europeans into close and sustained contact. And Peter has also produced some really what I call groundbreaking in terms of their unusual perspective monographs or edited volumes. I'm thinking particularly of his piece where he brought a number of his book where he brought a number of Japanese scholars to reflect on agrarian development and how Japanese perspectives on agrarian development could reflect and provide new perspectives on the same phenomenon in South Asia. I think if one were to say that there was an abiding constant within all his scholarship as to how he, no matter where he applied it, it is in his commitment to looking at ways in which we can bring local perspectives and more cosmopolitan perspectives together in unusual ways, and he has really gone against the established grain of wanting to provide master narratives, which were tended to be written from a sort of a more global Western cosmopolitan perspective, and showing some of the lacunae that are definitely apparent from those perspectives. So without further ado, what I would like to do is present the RAS Bicentenary Medal to Professor Peter Robb.
Thank you. Enjoy it. I'm, of course, very honored by this, and indeed flattered by the remarks you've just heard. I have to say, my own view of my contribution is somewhat more modest, but never mind. I think what has happened in the society, Norbert's quite right, it's got onto a more even and more interesting level, and various people, lots and lots of people were involved in that process. I was actually asked to give the AGM talk several decades ago. And when I did that, after a somewhat testy council meeting, I recognized that this was very distant from me physically, way across the other side of London, but also culturally. The people there were not like the people I was mixed with, and they weren't interested in the same things I was, with some honorable exception. I came into the society itself and became a fellow rather later. And the transformation in that culture, as well as the distance, was remarkable. I mean, and it seems to me that what we owe to people like Ellison, to the decision to make permanent staff members the key in terms of the running of society, with a presidential role which is still important and council members who are still important, but who nonetheless are not in day-to-day command and not really, in many senses, establishing the direction we're going to take. And I think that you just program of the society to see what's happened. It's become relevant, it's become culturally significant, it's become significant for a whole range of scholars. So I think we owe a lot, not to me particularly, but to that period and to this Ellison and her colleagues who were able to bring us in that direction. I thank you for your remarks about my writing. I'll do some advertising if I may. You know, I wrote, to my disbelief really, 3 books based on the enormous Richard Blessington diaries in the British Library. There's only 80-something volumes, but you get through. And I wrote one on sex and sensibility, and then I wrote one on, which is mainly about children, servants. And then I decided unexpectedly to write a 3rd, which was called Useful Friendship, which was about the links between people, Indian as well as European. And then COVID and the British Library crisis came along, and I thought, what on earth am I going to do? And to my even greater surprise, have ended up writing 4th. This is really quite embarrassing. But it's in press now, and it's called In Time. So look out for it in your bookshops. I'm also particularly honoured and pleased to be here this evening, prefacing a lecture by Tirthankar Roy. I have an enormous admiration for work, and I won't introduce him formally, but I will say that he has a particularly wide range of contributions. He's the sort of person that writes a short-ish, sort of 60, 80,000 word introduction to a subject, which is intended for the general reader or students or something. And you read it and you think, wow, I didn't think of it from that perspective. That's fantastic. And then he writes enormous amount of cooperation with other people. So there's all these really significant jointly authored people. So it's a whole team, which I think, frankly, is led by Tirthankar. And then, of course, he writes usual monographs. I actually don't know how he finds the time to do it. I've published quite a lot, but boy, this is another category. So I'm fascinated to hear as to say on this subject, and I shall leave the floor open to him being properly introduced by the chair. Thank you very much for this.
Well, it's a. Thank you very much, Peter. That was lovely. It's a great pleasure to, and thank you for suggesting that Tirthankar give this talk in particular. I've been since it was first mooted. I've really been looking forward to it. Tirthankar and I first met in the early 1990s at Cambridge when he was a frequent visitor to the Center of South Asian Studies, the Wednesday seminars, and I think you gave during that period in the mid-1990s, I think you gave maybe even 3 seminars that were absolutely mind-blowing at that time. We then, or you came up to Cambridge less often, and I briefly came down to the LSE, but for some reason we didn't really connect during that time. So it's been so I'm really pleased that you've come back. I am aware that, as Peter mentioned, you know, you are known for bringing these edited volumes together with incredibly insightful introductions, which I'm afraid the introductions get read, and people don't feel they don't have to read the rest of the volume. So your fellow authors probably have a cause to be somewhat hurt by that. But you've also then crafted significant essays throughout your career in all the top journals. And then right from the get-go, your monographs, initially dealing with agrarian economics and agrarian politics in South Asia, have been always welcome whenever they've come. So it's a great pleasure to give you the floor, hand the floor over to you, and it's yours.
Thank you, the organizers, for inviting me to this lecture series. I'm particularly pleased to be part of, for several decades now, has been a towering figure in our field, South Asian history and historiography. Produced many students who are now teaching history and South Asia in different parts of the world, different universities of the world. His work has been particularly influential and in my work, but also shaped many discourses. So I'm very glad, not only that I'm here, but also that Peter has no choice to be anywhere else except in this room and listen to me. If I face an audience of high school students or first-year undergraduates to talk about the British Empire, it's always a difficult challenge because empire is not taught properly or at all at high school or undergraduate levels. And most younger students gather their knowledge from trashy popular history or even trashier social media stuff. And inevitably, I'll face the question, so what do you think is the biggest legacy, some of the legacies of British rule in India that are still visible today? If you are asked to draw a line, a continuous line between, say, 1770s when the empire began and the present times, what would that be? Now, if I want to be lighthearted, I'll say cricket or tea or railways. That came a little later. If I want to be really serious, but in an audience consisting of economists, I will say institutions, and they will understand it, not first-year undergraduates. It's too abstract an idea. So what I do is the following. I'll tell them, well, think of the enormous army which British India left behind for India and Pakistan to inherit at 1947. Nothing like that almost anywhere outside the Western world existed in terms of scale. And there is no question that this army of more than 1 million people, more than 2 million people at its peak in 1945, created the modern political map of South Asia, consolidated something like 600 independent or different kinds of polities, state-like things into just 2 nations, defended the British Empire. It was Britain's army. The Royal Navy was another fighting force, but this was the army. The land army was Indian army. It protected the far-off places from Natal to Hong Kong, where Indians went to work. And on a negative note, it was a massive, massive drain on the budget. So much so that it shortchanged many other things that states need to do, like welfare or public goods. And India, South Asia, generally speaking, ended up with fairly poor record, even by developing country standards in things like healthcare, mass education, gender equality, partly for this reason. Now, then I will wear my historian's hat and say, how did this begin? And you have to go back to the 1700s to answer that question. And the puzzle there is huge. This is a merchant firm, East India Company. Merchants are not necessarily adept at either raising taxes or raising a military force, but they did it, and they did it from very unlikely beginnings. They were fighting with extremely well-trained Indian forces in the 1760s, the Marathas and Mysore. Even a little before that, the Carnatic warfare. And the first armies were scraped together from a contemporary source, factory doorkeepers and watchmen. Just give them a gun and send them to battle. 250,000 trained infantry, all regular soldiers, that is salaried, pensioned, which is not very usual among the Indian forces. Most of them were irregulars, part-time soldiers recruited when there was a battle. 250,000 of these people during the Great Rebellion, to 2.5 million in 1945. Now that's enormous, that's massive. How did it happen? It didn't happen by force, it happened by some kind of innovations. And most historians who have looked at the origin of the empire would work along those lines. Innovations. What kind of innovations? Well, now institutions come into play. At the first level, this sort of development, the build-up of a military force on such scale would need money. It's just not somebody's idea, let's do this. You need to raise money, and a very large quantity of money. You need to change completely the revenue system. But if this is not done by force, then there is something else going on here. And what that is redrawing the contract between taxpayers and the state. And back that contract with law. Now, that is a much more complicated enterprise. And my talk will be about a part of that enterprise. Now, there's no question it delivered. Whatever happened, and we are going to have a flavor of what happened, but it delivered. I mean, here, what you see here is a graph tracking revenue per person. So the rise you see is not by new conquest, it's by making the tax system work better. And the particular reform that I'm going to talk about is called permanent settlement in 1793 in Bengal, which happens about right in the middle of the shaded area. So for about 10 years before that, 10 years after that, there's possibly the sharpest rise in tax per head. So clearly it delivered. And how it delivered, what was the thinking behind that reform? That's going to be the subject today. Now, you will also observe, just to dwell a little more on this graph, that then the line flattened out. So there was a rise, but there was a kind of one-time boom, and this is a tax. So I mean, you can raise tax only up to a point. You cannot keep taxing people. So this is an institutional reform that delivered a one-time boom over 20, 30 years. What happened after that? Well, the state was big enough and stable enough to start borrowing in London. It could continue to be a fighting power. It could continue to expand, continue to invest, but by drawing on the financial markets in London. But that's another story. I'm not getting into the 19th century story. So what is at stake in this subject? Something quite big and an unfolding literature on the global history of fiscal modernization. Now, most Indian historians that we cite, whose works we read, whose works we teach, recognize that whatever happened in the early empire was not coming from application of force. It came from innovations. Fiscal innovations is part of it. But most writings that are relevant to the subject would stress something else, which is political alliance, accommodations, also strategy to redesign administration, public administration, almost always drawing on Indian elements. That's not surprising because this state actually inherited a bureaucratic administrative tradition, and they had limited options of changing it. So they were working within it. They were not trying to replace it. However, most of these writings, which are very central to this subject, do not actually talk about fiscal modernization. money part of this story. Now, when you observe a parallel set of research scholarship on how states came to be what they became in the 19th century, enormous fighting forces, you encounter a very strong stress, especially in economic history, on fiscal modernization, which means a process that whereby states, early modern states, shift from being domain states, that is reliant primarily on the king's own income from estates, to a tax state, imposing taxes. And of course, that doesn't happen without significant social contract, without quite a lot of political shifts and very complicated negotiations. But it did happen. And the second meaning of modernization is that in the process, would gather a lot more money than before. Centralization, call it, of revenues. That is very important for building a military. You need coherence in strategy, you need coherence in financial capacity. And that is something that happened in the 17th, 18th centuries in Europe. This is a primarily European literature. A significant strand within this literature, led by Patrick O'Brien, my former colleague and co-teacher in a course, in a global history course, suggests that, primarily comparing with the Habsburgs, that Britain was an exceptional pathway within this general tendency. It centralized much better, much more, partly by shifting from land taxes to indirect taxes, partly by relying on the debt market, Bank of England, and it was a very distinct pathway from the Habsburgs. I mean, the Habsburgs had a much more resources, but they were much more loosely organized empire. So Patrick O'Brien says this, and then says that this process had enormous spillover. Well, think of the Royal Navy, the world's most powerful naval force, which indirectly reduced the protection costs of private operators, private capitalists, entities like the East India Company, and also the Dutch East India Company. So Britain's fiscal exceptionalism made the empire. Now that claim is challenged, has been challenged. It's a still developing literature, but more and more people are going into studying what happened in the colonies. And the general finding, I mean, there's a very interesting work, again, by a former colleague, Alejandra Irigoyen, and her co-author, Regina Graf, on the Spanish-American fiscal modernization. And there are other people have moved into it. One of the historians that I collaborate with, Yoav Frankema, and Anne Booth published a book on fiscal capacity in the colonies. All of them are directing us to the idea that there was a parallel set of experiments building on regional resources and constraints happening in the colonies. Fiscal modernization did not have one center, certainly not a European center. And if you add them up, India, of course, would be a big site for that kind of experiments. If you add them up, then you get this idea that maybe the empire made British power, made Britain an imperial power. So that's what the debate is about. And what I do today is revisit a much more Indianist kind of debate about the permanent settlement, about land rights, and read it as a fiscal modernization project, not as many Indianist historians have done, as a doctrinal thing, an ideological thing, or a cultural thing. It's a fiscal modernization project. So let me get into the subject. What was the permanent settlement? The darker shade is the area where you have this particular kind of land rights, permanent settlement. In 1793, the East India Company government in Bengal introduced a policy where, at the first level, it defined land rights the taxpayer rights. Most taxes were coming from land, by the way. The land rights as ownership rights, a deed of ownership. Land rights weren't this before, not theoretically. There were tax collectors who had some right to the produce of the land, and there were farmers who had some right to use the land. There wasn't exactly a single ownership right which overrode everything. That's what was created. And because it was now a singular right, it could be defended by courts of law. It didn't need regulators or politicians to come into this process at all. Courts of law could take care of the protection of that right. The deed was offered to a group of rural magnates called zamindars. They were tax collectors in the Mughal administrative system before. But I mean, they're not really big guys, but they were more rooted in maybe large villages. But because nobody pays taxes willingly, they maintain a minimum power. The deed was was offered to zamindars. The revenue demand was fixed in money forever. Permanent has that one sense that the revenue was set forever, fixed forever. And it was set somewhat higher than what the zamindars were paying then. Zamindars would normally collect money rental from the farmers and keep a part of it for themselves and send the rest to the regional treasury. What they sent to the regional treasury, that was the benchmark, but the demand was set a little above that benchmark. Zamindars accepted the deal, partly because, probably because they thought that this was protection against, the legal protection particularly was not only against encroachment by outsiders, but also against the state itself. And the zamindars had some bad experience with the state before. Also, in theory, the zamindars could raise incomes, and any income that they raise will be theirs. So they could raise incomes by bringing more land under cultivation. Now, that was the incentive that was embedded in this arrangement. You do your stuff. I mean, yeah, we are not going to need more money. I mean, you keep. Now, something called permanent settlement was extended to the Coromandel region, quite several hundred miles long, possibly 100,000 square miles area, which the Hyderabad Nizam had gifted to the East India Company as protection money, as protection arrangement. And it's an area where English traders, British traders had been doing trade for a long time. It didn't really offer them much prospect for agricultural improvement. That changed when a canal system came in the late 19th century. It became one of the sites for an early green revolution. But before that, the company didn't really think it was a very valuable gift, but they knew that area, so they took it. And when they took it, they thought that this arrangement with the zamindars is probably a good idea. It's certainly an easier thing to do, and they did it. Now, they called it permanent settlement. Now, here comes one of the anomalies of what we are doing here, because South India, that part of South India, was nothing like post-Mughal North India or Bengal. So any reference to an inherited tradition, and we'll see lots of references to inherited tradition, didn't work to these two regions in a similar way. So whatever happened in Coromandel was not really what happened in Bengal, although they go by the same name. So, well, this is a caution for those who want to actually, study permanent settlement. We need to be careful. Okay, so the interesting thing is that it came in 1793, but for at least the company's state more or less started formally from 1765. That is 28 years, nearly 30 years. Before that, after the Battle of Plassey, East India Company was kind of partner or parasite on the Nawab of Bengal. So they knew zamindars. They knew that they are quite significant players in the fiscal system. Why wait for 30 years to do this? Well, what was happening during this time was a debate about the best way of redrawing the contract with taxpayers. There is a choice to have the zamindars as the taxpayers, give them the ownership deed, that piece of paper which is a legal paper, or settle with farmers, settle with peasants who are actually raising the crop and have the I mean, they actually handle the crop. Well, that wasn't quite discussed ever, because that would require information resources, political resources that the company knew they didn't have. But even when you settle with the zamindars, at what point do you settle? From what foundation do you settle? That's what the debate was about. And what you have here are two statements, one by Philip Francis, who was a member of the Council of Advisors for the Governor General in the 1770s, and the second one is Warren Hastings, who was the Governor General from 1772 for 13 years. A very powerful man, not a great orator or writer, but Philip Francis was something like a scholar. He was a great writer, wrote a lot about this problem. And in the 1770s, they had a debate with very sharply polarized view about the zamindar. Now, what is behind this, I have to explain. But you can read the statements. Francis had great regard for zamindars, which is coming from his regard for the Mughal heritage, that these are the inheritors of the Mughal tradition. And Warren Hastings doesn't think much of these guys. Now, what is behind it? Well, behind it is this anxiety that you have an arrangement with a group of people on whatever ground that they represent some great tradition. But you don't know how reliable they are or what their taxable capacity. It's a bad deal. First find out whether they are going to shortchange the state or not, and then have the arrangement. You need data on the zamindar. That's what the debate is about. Now, Francis was, this is a much written about dispute between two individuals. Most of what has been written about focuses on their personalities, because they were rivals in many ways, and they had quite public paps, and they lived in this claustrophobic environment, social environment of Calcutta city, which Peter has written about. And so much of, if you read that literature, you will think that their difference is really stemming from their personality differences, but that's not the case. For 30 years, other people have been debating exactly the same thing. If we have an arrangement with the zamindars, we should do it from a position of strength, which means knowing who they are. And Francis said, essentially implied, that's an expensive route. Settle down because people will accept it. Now, Francis, as I said, was something like a scholar, orator. He studied a lot. He had a great regard for Mughal heritage, and also, like many scholars, had a romanticized idea about the past. He thought that we have to rule with reference to the Mughals, but he didn't really factor in the period of time when the Mughal Empire collapsed remarkably quickly, dramatically. In rebellion, it was kind of lost to rebellions and provincial and attacks. That wasn't quite part of Francis' narrative. Now, what was at stake was something, I mean, going back to the fiscal modernization story, kind of universal challenge, redefine contract with taxpayers. Modernity means doing this cheaply with high returns on a large scale. But the specific challenge of Bengal was that farmers were the taxpayers. They paid taxes to zamindars. Are these people reliable? Are they capable? Are they credible? How would the state know? And the outcome was the permanent settlement, which looks like a settlement with the zamindars, kind of giving in sovereign power. Not quite. I'll come back to that. Now, permanent settlement has been studied in the Indianist scholarship for years. And most of it is about, well, part of it is about the legacy, which I'm not going to get into. Part of it is about the origin question. What was new? Well, what was new was, I mean, the concept of private property was not new. It's not something that the British created in India at all. However, the package of ownership as private property as ownership and the legal deed and the law and the judicial infrastructure, that package was new. And that package is a very powerful one. I'll come back to that. The origin question also asks why the zamindars, why not the farmers, and why wait? Now, if you study this literature, you will see essentially that most of the more famous things that have been written about the permanent settlement will explain it as a kind of transplant of an English concept of the country landlord. From James Mill, who was historian, intellectual, and employee of the East India Company, down to many other influential writers, that notion has passed on, and it still is quite popular. The British were looking for some kind of aristocrat society, and they thought that the zamindars are good candidates for that. Now, the problem here is that in none of the documents that you read from that time, nobody, no political administrator says, England, let's copy this here. There's never that kind of a sentiment. These people were smart. If they refer to a past heritage, they refer to the Mughals and said that, you know, we are inheritors of a Mughal tradition. We have to work within it. Now, there is another version of the transplant theory, which is a little more complicated, and that's become kind of canonical story in permanent settlement literature. It's a book by Ranajit Guha, the historian, who published this book in, I think, 69 or a little before that. And essentially arguing that some of the most influential advisors and writers of that time were writing about Bengal and about this tax contract were very influential by the French physiocratic doctrine, which doesn't exactly see land as a sort of tied to a kind of aristocratic society. It looks at land as a capitalist wealth creating asset. And essentially, physiocracy is a campaign for creating capitalism in the countryside with land as the primary asset. And Guha's argument was that the Bengal debaters, or some of them, were influenced by this, and the permanent settlement was a colonial experiment to create capitalism in landed property. Now, as I said, I mean, the literature is very large, and here is just a very random selection of things that have gone into the permanent settlement. It hasn't actually, I mean, none of these works will offer you a radically different view from the two transplant models that I've discussed. Now, when Guha's work was published in the 60s, relatively young scholars like Ashim Dasgupta, a very famous name in our field, and Peter Marshall reviewed the book and said something which makes a lot of practical sense, that, well, this register, this ideological cultural register, is overplayed in Guha. These people who are sitting in Bengal debating policy were actually much more worried about the immediate context. And I mean, they might have done something that looks like physiocratic, but their motives were very different. And Guha actually doesn't look at that at all. So that leads me to this tiny model. Of course, any institutional change is big, and this is certainly a big one. And what we have talked so far in the transplant models is transplant ideas is the doctrinal side of it, which definitely does play a role. Not going to dispute that. But then what you also heard is the need for data. You have to find out more about the people who are involved and what their intentions are. And of course, the administration is being pushed. Remember that 1760s and 70s were very bad time for the company, militarily speaking. They had lost a battle to Mysore Hyder Ali. They had lost a battle to Mahaji Scindia in central India, and it wasn't a great time. So they were under pressure. Okay, so as I said, the debate has been going on for a long time. Almost an entire generation were writing about permanency. They didn't use the word in the sense of holding revenue demands constant forever. That was not the sense of permanency. Permanency meant permanency of British power. As I said, I mean, this was a time when British power was threatened, and they were trying to do something about that, and that something was building stable fiscal institutions. In this joint sense, the idea was discussed by most administrators over a very long period of time. And if you observe, if you read closely some of the stuff that, some of the many things that Philip Francis wrote about this, you will also see another idea, which is that this is a merchant body. It started as a merchant body. Commercial motives were very much central when it began acquiring territory in India, but it has to shed that identity. It has to move towards being a government. And I mean, this tension between the commercial lobby and the governing lobby was quite intense, and it was played out throughout this time. The commercial lobby kind of lied low, but they were quite powerful in London side. But lay low, but they were quite prominent on the London side. However, the company, as a government, when it could, transferred a part of the taxes to that lobby to keep them quiet. Increasingly, they were not doing it and saying things which said why they are not doing it. And the Bengal administrators were a big vocal lobby doing it, suggesting why we need to change our priorities. Permanency came from had that context as well. But so there was not much debate about what permanency really meant. But where there was a debate, and the slide you saw before, was whether there was much dispute either on what kind of property right it should be. It should be an ownership right. But are the people who are getting that piece of paper, the deed, really worthy of it? And the Francis general take on this question was that based on, as I said, a kind of theory of statecraft, is that partnership with zamindars who represent ancient Mughal heritage is a cheaper option and also politically the more expedient option. But it does give away too much power to a class of people who may not deliver to the state. And Hastings, now this gentleman is interesting because he has a kind of instinctive distrust for council members. He's not much of a theoretician, doesn't write much. And his closest advisors, he spoke fluent Persian, and he was surrounded by Indian advisors. So there was a kind of informal council that advised him. And he has very strong instinct about these, which came from discussions with these guys. And that instinct told him that the zamindars are not reliable. We need to find out who can be a partner to this enterprise. And you need data. So gather data on land's ability to pay before striking a deal. Now, until that, Hastings actually did institute an office which will collect this data, but it had, remember, this is 100,000 square miles with possibly 45 million people. Most of them are farmers, peasants, many hundreds of zamindars. 2 office bearers were going to collect this data. Now, that's all the money he had for this data project. So what happens when you do this? Well, you rely on auctions, of course. That's a very standard way. Sometimes auctions are seen as a way of the state retreating. I mean, it's a weakness of the state, but it's not. There's substantial European literature, theoretical literature, which will tell you that auctions are good when sellers do not know the price the buyers are willing to pay. So the price is the value of the estate, and the tax, the rent depends on that. So you don't know anything about the zamindars, you farm the tax. Somebody else will come and take it, and they will reveal what value you think that estate should carry. But auctions have two problems. Most people who took this, who took these auctions and took these estates, the tax farmers, were not zamindars. I mean, they came from somewhere outside. They were commercial actors, small town, big shots. And when they went to the countryside, they were either rivals of the zamindars, and the landlords will do everything in their power to make sure that the auction fails, contract fails, or they would collude with the zamindar, in which case they can shortchange the state. And that happens in auctions all the time. If the buyers collude, they can really do damage to the seller. So when that happens, the auctions actually give some powers away. Once again, we get back to the question, are the people receiving the gift worth it? Now, from this time onward, you'll see that every time a land right is discussed, whether in South India, in Coromandel, in anywhere, in Bengal, the accent on data is paramount. I mean, it's central. Every document says that we need data. And there's a long list, almost an impractically long list of things that you need data on. Data was key, and the word information surprisingly appears time and time again. Every 3 pages, you have somebody saying information. But as I said, it was bound to fail. The data project was bound to fail. I mean, the government just didn't have, it costs money to collect data. The government just didn't have that money. More than money, they realized eventually that the zamindar out there in the village knows something which the state can never hope to know, which is the reliability of the tenant farmers under them. So just knowing the zamindar or knowing the value of the estate is getting you nowhere. The information project is right from the start not going to work. So there's a huge conflict of interest built into it. Now, the person who actually instituted the permanent settlement was Charles Cornwallis, Governor General at that time. And if you observe what he did, he was a very active man and left quite a significant impact on administration, evolution of the public administration of the time. But when you look closely at exactly what he did, he of course made permanent settlement a law. That came about 6 or 7 years after he started ruling. And Guha says that, well, I think Thomas Law was his advisor and persuaded him. That's not credible. Everybody knew. I mean, this debate has been repeated like a broken record for 30 years. So it's not as if he didn't know the terms of the debate. When he came, he said, yes, we need more data. But then he shifted priorities, and he spent a lot of energy on the judicial infrastructure and making laws. The major takeoff in legislation and a kind of legislative way, idea of institutional change really happened during his time. What did that all add up to? Well, there was this other idea. If the regulators cannot beat the zamindars with superior information or superior power, beat them with the courts. If you have a marketable deed, and if a zamindar doesn't play by the rule, sooner or later that deed is going to come to the court. And when that happens, the court collects actionable data. If the state cannot, courts will. Only when there's a problem. A mortgage that has not been paid, or an estate dividing up, or a dispute within the zamindari family about zamindars, about the estate. It's not a new idea. Francis actually first said that fear of sale is a very important disciplining device. But of course, you have to have a quite a capable judicial system to make that fear real. And that is exactly what happened. A big part of the legacy literature, many people have looked at how estates divided up, changed hands, came to courts, became smaller, how zamindars demilitarized within decades, and by the early 19th century, it was a completely different world. But in between, it had delivered money. So I'll now conclude in 5 points. The debate in the late 18th century was not a doctrinal debate. It was about fiscal consolidation. The context of the debate was limited data on taxable capacity of the agents, their reliability, and limited capacity to gather the data. Permanent settlement was a compromise, looks like a compromise. It abandoned the data project to settle with the magnates. But was it a compromise? Land rights, redefined as ownership, allowed courts to defend the deed, producing actionable data which the state couldn't collect given its constraints and given the scarcity of reliable informants. The debate left a legacy. Data collection became central to governance, especially in relation to the countryside. There was no smooth trajectory after that. I mean, there was the data project really evolved in fits and starts, but Bailey in Empire and Information does actually have just one sentence saying that the permanent settlement started it. Just one sentence, nothing else. But I think he was right. As I say, in name, the permanent settlement was transplanted to Coromandel. And here you have one of the landlord estates. But the context and the political heritage there was radically different. And if you remember, these administrators were citing political heritage all the time. What did they cite there? Why was it called by this name? And what was it? This is still an open question. I'll stop there. Thank you. Shall I keep standing here?
Yes, stand here.
Okay.
Thank you, Tirthankar. That's a lovely talk and entirely within the spirit of Peter's career and the type of analysis that he would have provided. So thank you very much for doing something so apt on the occasion. I have two questions for you before opening up to the floor, and I'll ask one now and perhaps one later. And one of the things that you did so nicely was to show how a set of wants or lacks in knowledge of the country was impelling a particular drive in the colonial administration, the types of innovations that they were making, desires that they were trying to actualize. And you argue that then makes it the two variants of the transplant theory that you outlined make less sense within this context. I was curious as to whether you could further strengthen this sort of argument by an actual explicit comparison with what was going on, not just between Bengal and South India, but also with England at the same time. Were you seeing the emergence of a type of fiscal modernity in England that was following a different set of trajectory because of the slightly different set of local conditions and constraints with which British officials were trying to engage in, which I think would actually further add another string to your bow. So I was wondering if you
completely agree with you. I mean, when we came to that first transplant side, I was thinking, what am I missing out here? I mean, I wanted to say something else. Now, what I wanted to say was exactly what you said, which is that this is precisely the period when England's fiscal system is moving away from land and moving towards indirect taxes and debt. So this is not the time when you look up to the landlord and think that this is the way to go. So it's not a consistent, even if you agree that there was some degree of influence coming from the way you think about class countryside. So thank you. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Ivan, you were first up.
Thank you. Intriguing. So at the beginning of the period you're looking at, to what extent do you think the company is or its agents are thinking of themselves as tax farmers? Because clearly what I think you're arguing for is that we should not see this in isolation as a fiscal issue, but as a fiscal administrative issue. And second, slightly different question is, how important was the land revenue to the company, I don't know, within Bengal or more generally over the sort of, I don't know, 50 years up to the end of the commercial monopoly? That's probably the useful time to think about it.
Very good questions. Well, the revenue farming, I think the people that I showed, I mean, we have some say in the policy. They never took it as a solution to this problem. So the tax farming arrangements were always time bound. They were called 10-year settlements, 5-year settlements, before the permanent settlement came into being. So there was always the idea that this is a transitional thing, but what it is leading up to was not very clear to most people.
I think perhaps more what I was asking is whether in the early stage that the company overall just saw this as an opportunistic way of France at the time was dominated by the Fermier Général, the tax farmers. This was something that was practiced. I mean, goodness, even the early inland revenue agents were actually tax farmers. Did they just see this at the beginning as a commercial opportunity, and it turned into something where they realized it became really important to how they had to run the place?
I kind of agree with you there, although I cannot think of an evidence which actually say that, yes, this is what we should do. But I think it's consistent with the fact that the revenue system which the East India Company inherited from the Nawab's administration already had a lot of revenue farming built in. The Nawab was trying to do something which is exactly like what the company was trying to do, which is to bring some stability. Not the immediate preceding Nawabs, but the two individuals particularly were Murshid Quli Khan in the early 18th century. He understood exactly this problem, that the zamindars are going to take me for a ride and I have to do something. And also that many of the zamindars were not performing. So tax farmer is a good way to solve this problem, bypass this problem, but it creates its own challenges. But it was being used, probably not everywhere, but it was being used. So I mean, if I am in 1765 in the company's establishment, I would think that, well, this is an option, second best, but I cannot change it. I have to live with it. So it's part of that tradition. Your second question about the dependence on land tax is an interesting one, because what's happening in the early period of the company is that they are actually, again, breaking away from the European tradition. They are actually reducing the amount of money that they collect from indirect taxes. So they're trying to standardize transit taxes, commodity taxes, trade taxes, and also reduce the incidence. Unlike the Mughal system, where practically half was collected from transit taxes. And the land dependence increased during the early company rule. And it was something like maybe 70% of the income was coming from land. It was a big deal.
Two questions. First is really just one of clarification. You showed a slide at the beginning when you were talking about the cost of the army skyrocketing over the whole period, which looked at revenue per head. And I wondered quite what that meant. Who are the heads? Is that per head of population?
Yes.
Per head of taxpayer?
No, per head of
It's
population.
total population.
It's per head of population and per unit of area. So essentially, the only point you can make from that kind of average is that it's not new conquest that is driving this.
Yes.
So that was the only point I made. I mean, if you really look at state capacity in relation to the economy, then you need to have something else that is normalizing this. It could be either gross domestic product or maybe average wages or something like that.
Yes, I see. My question relates to the issue of legacy, because if I've understood this right, it doesn't really matter whether you're on the side of Hastings or Francis in the legacy debate. There has to be a legacy in the sense that there is a pre-existing system.
Yes.
Call it what you will in Bengal, zamindars.
Yeah.
What was the system in Coromandel?
Well, fundamentally, it is former tax collectors or mini princes who live in a fort. They were given the ownership deed.
And was that related to farming and food production?
That's the thing, that many of these guys were not like the Bengal zamindars. They were not exactly rooted in the village.
Mm-hmm.
They were more like warlords, and that created a complication.
Yes.
But the other thing, of course, I mean, from the tenants' point of view, and much of the legacy debate really looks at what happened to the farmers after this deed, and were they disempowered in some sense, or were they evicted, or what did the zamindars do? I mean, did they oppress them using this deed? The evidence is very mixed, and more on the side that nothing much happened, because most of the zamindars were exactly as Hastings predicted, not really good for much. They certainly didn't understand agriculture very well. So they had to rely on the farmers, and the general outcome was that that reliance created a kind of coalitions of sort in the countryside, but the farmers on average didn't either get better off or worse off.
Was a similar system set up in the lands which were conquered from the Marathas?
No, completely different.
Mm.
Partly because, I mean, practically anywhere, that Coromandel included, where you cannot refer to Mughal heritage, you cannot, I mean, this argument fails about why you need permanent settlement, that this is the tradition of the land. Philip Francis' line of argument fails where you do not have a very well-defined political heritage, imperial heritage. That works in northern India, that works in Bengal. It doesn't work almost anywhere else anywhere in the Deccan countryside. So almost anything that happened in southern India was an improvisation, and it adapted to the local conditions, but you do not really have this ideological line there. And the question is, then what line do you take?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Tirthankar, for first your remarks about me, but secondly for having fulfilled my comment that you present something new that we haven't thought of before, which I think is correct. I'm particularly struck by the crucial role of military expenditure and all of this. And I'm also fascinated by the connections you drew. I mean, I've written at tedious length about the importance of property ownership and that concept. I've written about the crucial character of data protection, equally at tedious length. And I've written about several other things that you've talked about. I didn't make the connections. And I think that the idea that the crucial thing in the 1770s was lack of data, unwillingness to risk entrusting a particular intermediary, and how that was resolved in the permanent settlement is very persuasive, and it's something I'd not thought of. Another thing connection I'd not thought of before. I wonder though about other factors in the period. I mean, in this thing I've been on time, there's a whole chapter about debt, and that leads me into talking about money and the problems with money. Not in terms of enough of it. That was a real problem for the East India Company, because the income was cyclical. Couldn't predict exactly when you sent a ship to England and when it came back and all those sorts of things. You couldn't exactly predict, and they got lost at sea, and there were all sorts of problems of that sort. And they were forever running on credit. They had, and in fact, employees at the company didn't get paid for 6 months, or they were promised, and they had to apply for their money and through advertisements in the paper and all that sort of thing. It was chaotic. Yeah. And by the way, I've got some things about other forms of chaos in that period. It was pretty characteristic about, and the Philip Francis Hastings was in a way another example of decision and chaos. But I wonder what part in this was played by that period of the famine of Bengal, the crisis of the countryside, the fact that you couldn't trust a bunny. Yeah. They were saying that a coin issued by the company through its mills was not accepted by a beggar after 3 weeks, because it was so debased and the coinage was so. So all of that seemed to me to be forcing people at the time to actually rely on credit. And the whole thing ran on borrowing and promises and so on. And in a way, it's not true. This period of chaos is beginning to be resolved by the 1790s. Yes. It's a different feeling. And of course, you've got banks set up, you've got legal structure, you've got an administrative system, as you say. They cancel some of the village level administration, but they make much stronger all the other forms of scrutiny, particularly the courts, and they get all the sales courts and also the resumption proceedings, which are all part of. They produce masses and masses of this. So that I agree entirely that that's a new period which begins to create some kind of fiscal evolution and development. What about the character of the period before, in terms of money, in terms of credit, in terms of debt, in terms of the crisis of money? I'd be interested to know what you think about.
Great question. I don't think I have a ready answer to that, but I'll tell you my approach to this. I mean, well, first of all, this is coming from what my ambition is to produce a bigger work, of which one part, I mean, this is institutional change, and the other big puzzle here, as I said before, is Madras Zamindari. Exactly what kind of piece that was. But the third thing is to look at fiscal data more closely and try to make some sense of exactly your kind of question. And we see broad continuities between, say, 1765 to 72. By that time, the parliamentary politics was very aware that Bengal, that India, company's territory in India needs our intervention. And there's a very well-articulated reason why it needs that. But I guess your question is really about the 7 or 8 crucial years before that. Yeah. Now, it's very hard to find, I mean, there's clearly not much of an articulated administrative discussion or policy discussion at this time. It's a few individuals, and we know really, really little about those individuals. I mean, only Clive kind of dominates, but Clive had, I mean, he was everywhere. He didn't really focus on Bengal. But as for the other administrators, we know rather little. However, one way to settle that problem would be to look at the fiscal data, and because budget data starts from 1763. 2 people have compiled the data. It's public domain. I mean, there's not much innovation involved in creating that, in reading that data, but it's John Richards compiled the data just before he died, and there was another book that came from America, which compiled it until 1781. You can look at that data and try to read whether these 2 periods are fundamentally different or are they doing the same thing. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to do now. My sense is that the problems that appear in 1770s in a more articulated way at their beginning before. the company was engaged in, well, several things, fighting, in which it did very badly, and in the late 1760s. And then the famine came, and the famine revealed how poorly it the company's administration was integrated with the Nawab's administration. I mean, neither of these two information centers understood or knew what was going on when millions of people were dying. So I think that's about as much as we can read from chaos. But the chaos doesn't, I don't think there was a design there that the commercial lobby was manipulating the accounts. I mean, it was still trying to become a state with many limited resources, with many reverses. It didn't have an army. That was the big handicap. And what you observe 10 years later is some of these things becoming policy matters. But I don't think it's a very different time.
Thank you very much, sir, for that illuminating talk. You spoke a little bit about the auction side. And as someone whose ancestors were part of that territory, and apparently it was sold in auction as well to a family which was who were landowners across the then United Provinces, which became later United Provinces. My question for you is just to understand a bit more about this process, and in terms of, did that end, of course it entailed the change in ownership as such, but as far as the actual tilling of the land was concerned, were they also able to get people from outside the village or the area to kind of do that, or was it just very notional on paper that it's being sold in auction, but the actual tillers remain the farmers or the tenants who were actually doing that even before the rent was not paid? So I'll just be very happy to have your thoughts on that. Thank you.
It's a great question, and I cannot often think of actually looking into this data. It probably exists in some of the bigger zamindaris like Dinajpur, where auctioneers were handling hundreds of thousands of acres of land. That's really big. I mean, there's no one party could control the operations there. If you cannot, I mean, if you want to break Westlands, for example, after picking an auction, you do have the option of bringing outsiders in. By default, I don't think that was happening on a large scale because it doesn't show up in population movement data. There isn't a lot of data, but at least some mention that there are systematic or large groups of people were being brought from outside to work for the auctioneer and bypass the landlord. I don't think that was happening on an extensive scale because nobody really, the people who took these options were mostly small players, and the estates were small in size. But my tentative answer is that that wasn't quite an option that was exercised, and probably you needed a secure property right to do that.
I'm sure that's right about the auctions, but the interesting thing about the next period, apart from the fact that there was always a degree of migrant labor in agriculture, seasonal labor and so on, it's interesting that there's quite a lot of non-resident people in the later years. So something is happening because of the ownership, and that's quite interesting in itself in terms of new lands and the cultivation, but also on the rights within the village. And there's an awful lot about this, of course, in the tenancy debates later on.
Absolutely, you are right. I mean, that's where the changes were happening, but I would time it a little later. And the huge Chotnagpur integration with Lower Bengal is a massive story.
Do you know what the aggregate revenue before and after the permanent settlement was? And we know it was 4 crores in Mughal India.
Yes, I do know that, but I can kind of work out the number from the graph, but it will be a very quick calculation. Let me see if I can tell you that. Oh, can I? Yeah. So, if the pound per head or pound per square mile is probably more promising, is revenue per head is the secondary axis. So if that is about 45 pounds, let's say 40 pounds, multiply that by 100,000 square miles, 120,000 square miles, that would be the approximate revenue. Sorry? About the same as? 4 crore. 4 million pounds. Possibly, yeah. 4 million, possibly. Yeah, no, that makes sense because Mir Qasim's time, the revenue was 2.6 or something billion pounds. Yes, that kind of makes sense.
Well, I'll reserve my second question for
Yeah.
dinner.
Yeah, okay, good. Part of that.
And but let's give Tirthankar a warm round of applause for stimulating.